The movie opens in the late 1800s. We are introduced to Ephraim Winslow, a retired timberman in search of employment on a boat. He arrives on a remote island on the Scottish shore, where the previous wickies are leaving. He gets employed as a wickie for a lighthouse keeper for 4 weeks on an island, where he is accompanied by Thomas Wake, a 65-year-old grumpy and peculiar individual who has been living there already. That morning, Winslow enters his new bedroom and finds a hole in his bed. He inspects the hole and finds a small wooden mermaid carving which he discreetly hides in his pocket. At night, they both dine together, and Winslow discovers that Wake is rather a strange person with odd interests. Wake offers alcohol to Winslow for a toast, but Winslow refuses because he is quitting drinking. Wake considers it bad luck to leave a toast hanging, so he forces him to drink, but Winslow empties his cup and toasts with water. Later at night, Wake climbs up to the lantern chamber on top of the lighthouse and undresses himself. He sits in front of the light and gazes at it, as if seduced by it. Meanwhile, Winslow notices the light from outside and walks towards the sea, only to see a vision of a mermaid in the water. He suddenly wakes up, realizing it was a dream. During his stay, Winslow is assigned the most grueling tasks, stirring the oil barrack, bearing heavy gasoline cans, and emptying their chamber pots. He encounters a seagull that creates a hurdle during his work. Afterward, he takes a pail of oil up to the lighthouse to rekindle it. He tries to enter the lantern chamber, but Wake stops him, reminding him that only he can enter there. Winslow gets curious but ignores it. Later, during dinner, he mentions a seagull bugging him, but Wake says it's bad luck to kill a seagull because seagulls are reincarnated soldiers who died in the sea. Winslow considers it a tall tale, so Wake smacks him in the head. Winslow gets furious, but Wake apologizes and changes the subject. At night, Winslow notices the same seagull by his window, interrupting his sleep. The next morning, Winslow drags the burrow wheel full of coal up to the lighthouse, only to get berated by Wake. Wake scolds Winslow for not cleaning properly and forces him to clean 10 times again. Winslow argues that he didn't join this place to become a slave because he cleaned the place twice, but Wake disagrees. He claims that Winslow is neglecting his duties, which are to obey his command, even if it is to reconstruct the entire lighthouse again. He threatens to dock his wage. Subsequently, Wake makes Winslow paint the lighthouse by hanging him with a rope, which eventually breaks, and Winslow falls to the ground. Moments later, he wakes up to a seagull pecking at his pants. At night, Wake asks Winslow what his previous profession was, and Winslow reveals he was a timberman, but came here when he found out he could make $1,000 here. This way, he could buy a house and have a fresh start. Wake opens up and reveals that he has spent most of his life working around the ocean. That's why his marriage didn't work. The next day, Winslow finds Wake moaning in the light chamber and notices an octopus tentacle. Later that day, Winslow finds a dead seagull in the well. Suddenly, another seagull attacks him, so Winslow beats it to death. Winslow gets back to work with Wake, and at night they feast and get drunk. They sing, argue, and dance. The next morning, Winslow walks towards the shore and finds a beautiful mermaid. The mermaid wakes up and screams as Winslow runs back into the lighthouse. Now 4 weeks have passed, and it's time for their departure. Due to wild storms and weather conditions, no boat or ferry arrives to pick them up. Due to the storm, their food had been rotten, and they only had a few reserved items left that were buried in the lighthouse. They dig the reserve, and there's no food but only alcohol, so they decide to wine away their woes in alcohol before the next ferry comes, which could take months. This meant they were both stuck together, even though they were starting to loathe and despise each other. Wake explains that the storm is going to affect the ferry somehow, and it will definitely take a significant amount of time for the ferry to arrive. Finally, with increasing nights of drinking companionship, the two constantly fight each other, but spend more time together. One night, going to bed drunk, Winslow assaults Wake by teasing him of being a cook. This makes Wake angry, and in a fit of rage, he swears at Winslow and wishes Neptune to drown him to death right there on the stage in a fierce speech. Further, for days, the storm persists, and the mental state of Winslow slowly deteriorates. After following Winslow to the top level of the lighthouse, he sits underneath the light chamber and wonders what the secret of that room is. He tries to open the door, but fails, so he sneaks into Wake's room while he is sleeping. He tries to steal the key for the light chamber, but Wake opens his eyes. He doesn't suspect Winslow of stealing the keys, and he tells him to get back to work. Winslow starts to get more unstable and starts pleasing himself with the wooden mermaid carving he found earlier. Later on, he pulls up a lobster pot, in which he finds the severed head of a man with only one eye. At night, he gets more drunk with Wake. They both start dancing together and get quite touchy. They both then start fighting and knock each other out. Moments later, Winslow finally opens up to Wake and reveals his name is not Ephraim Winslow. He admits that he is an imposter timberman, and his real name is Thomas Howard. Thomas had murdered the real Ephraim Winslow to take his place, and he used his name everywhere he worked. Thomas goes to sleep and sees another terrifying vision where he sees himself on the top of the lighthouse, and suddenly Wake appears behind him with his eyes glowing. He wakes up and tries to escape the island on a salvage lifeboat, but Wake catches up with him and axes the boat because he doesn't want Thomas to abandon him. Thomas runs back into the lighthouse as Wake chases him with the axe. He ambushes him in the house and confronts Thomas for abandoning his post. He threatens to call the authorities on him for neglecting his duties and violating his work contract. But it does not affect Thomas anymore because he is very unstable now. Thomas reveals that he knows Wake axed his former wickie because he found his severed head a few days ago. Wake is puzzled because Thomas is talking gibberish at this point, and Wake mentions reporting him for confessing about his true identity. He starts gaslighting Thomas and tells him that he axed their lifeboat, not him. Thomas calms down and sits on the sofa to recollect himself. Now they both had run out of alcohol, so they mix honey with oil and drink it. The same night, the storm becomes more unstable, and water breaks into the lighthouse, ruining the entire room and furniture. Thomas wakes up and stumbles upon Wake's work ledger. He goes through it and finds upsetting entries about him. He confronts Wake and tells him to quit his yapping because he is sick of him. Thomas points out that Wake is a grumpy and smelly old liar. Wake relives Thomas from his duties, but Thomas brings out the ledger and reveals he had that part already figured out. He tears out pages from the ledger and points out how untrue they are. Thomas gets emotional and gets on his knees. He mentions that he has learned a lot from him and begs Wake to let him go to the lantern room so he can see what the mystery behind it is. Wake is not amused by it and still doesn't let him see it. Thomas gets furious and curses Wake. He mentions that this is the reason his wife and kids left him, because he is self-observed and he will die like this. Wake taunts Thomas, calling him a murderer. He asks Thomas if he is going to murder him as well, just like he murdered his old acquaintance. Thomas loses his cool and starts beating Wake. While beating him, Wake suddenly changes into the original Ephraim Winslow, which freaks out Thomas. He still attacks him, and Ephraim suddenly changes into the mermaid he keeps hallucinating. The mermaid chokes Thomas with her tentacles, and she suddenly turns into Wake, who looks like a sea creature.